There are three levels of conflict: inner conflicts, sometimes known as intrapersonal conflicts, man versus himself, and by man I'm including woman with that. Inner conflicts are most effective if you can find a way to externalize them. There's a great Star Trek The Next Generation episode, the third season finale, The Best of Both Worlds, Part 1, where Commander Riker is having a crisis of conscience. And the cool thing about the way the writers set that up is everything he's thinking about himself, a new officer, a new character, Lieutenant Commander Shelby, played by Elizabeth Dennehy, is says to his face, basically, if you can't make the hard decisions, step aside for those of us who can. And it really gets under his skin, and he talks to his former girlfriend, future wife, Counselor Deanna Troy, about it. And she basically tells him, "You're growing up, you're seasoned." And he takes it as kind of an insult, but he realizes that she's right. But Jonathan Frakes really hit the ball out of the park with that portrayal, because that inner conflict he's feeling is externalized by having this other person throw in his face the things he's thinking himself. Speaking of which, personal conflicts, man versus man. And those are the most common dramatic conflicts. Two people want the same thing, and that brings them into conflict. Cops and robbers, prosecuting attorneys, defense attorneys. Those are police dramas and medical dramas are two of the three main types of dramas on television. Doctor shows, not quite as much. It's not really man versus man per se, unless it's House where he hates everybody. And finally, you have extrapersonal conflicts: man versus society, man versus nature, man versus the unknown, man versus God. Lost, when it was working, especially season one, excelled because they would layer the different levels of conflict for the same character or group of characters, which kind of maximizes the potential for audience engagement. To truly get at your character, you need to get at your emotional truth, which means to get inside them, you need to get inside yourself. Some people don't want to go there, but I've had to tell students in the past, if you really want to be a great writer, you've got to be willing to go there and deal with those uncomfortable things that you're feeling or thinking. Some of the defining factors: inner backstory, what's happened before your story begins; the unconscious, what's going on inside the person's mind that they're not acknowledging; personality differences. Uh, I often ask students, do you ever have two friends whose only connection is you? And when you're not around, either they have no connection at all or they're always fighting. On the classic Mary Tyler Moore show, Mary had two good friends, Rhoda and Phyllis, who were like that. They each got spin-offs. Spinning off Phyllis didn't really make any sense, except for Cloris Leachman has been, and always shall be amazing. But of course, Rhoda was always down on herself. Phyllis always thought too highly of herself. Mary somehow was friends with both of them, but these two women had no connection other than Mary. And abnormal behavior. Think of Jack Nicholson in As Good as It Gets, where he's OCD and has certain routines or rituals he goes through in his daily life. Burrow inside your character's mind, discover his or her dreams, fears, strengths, weaknesses, etc. Then, knowing her aspects and potential, create an incident geared to her unique nature, the inciting incident. There's so much work that has to be done before you start writing your script. I cannot highlight or emphasize that enough. Some young writers just want to start writing immediately, and that's almost a surefire way for disaster to strike. Focus on that moment when a character takes an action expecting a useful reaction from the world, but instead, the effect of the action provokes the forces of antagonism. The character's world reacts differently than expected, more powerfully than expected, or both. There's so many great examples of this. There's a great movie called Little Children with Kate Winslet in it. But one of the movies I talk about recently, and I'm not a Tom Cruise fan, full disclosure, but Jerry Maguire, I love. Cameron Crowe arguably wrote the screenplay and directed the film, one of my favorite Crowe films. Even though I'm not a Tom Cruise fan, the thing I love about Jerry Maguire, it starts where most Tom Cruise films end. The cocky young hotshot with daddy issues meets a fascinating woman who helps him become a better man. And in Jerry Maguire, instead of being at the end of the movie, that happens at the beginning. Jerry has this epiphany about the things we think but do not say, and he gets fired. And that's bad. But it's great story. It's a great story. The audience bond. Your protagonist must be empathetic. Your audience must be able to feel for him or her. He or she may not be sympathetic. They may not be likable. Think Julianne Potter in My Best Friend's Wedding, the Julia Roberts character. And by the way, not a big Julia Roberts fan either, but there were 3 out of 4 movies in a row that I really liked. My Best Friend's Wedding, Notting Hill, and then Erin Brockovich. Not really a fan of Runaway Bride. Um, but the thing I admire about Robert's performances, especially in Notting Hill and My Best Friend's Wedding, her character is kind of a jerk. I mean, for a movie star to be willing to play an unsympathetic character, she's got she's got chops and cojones. Think about Walter White in Breaking Bad, and this is a fascinating case study because Walter White is an anti-hero. He is not a good guy, and yet so many people wanted him to get away with everything he was doing. Vince Gilligan was interviewed by Conan O'Brien, and Vince Gilligan told Conan, "Yeah, I hate Walter because he's a terrible person." And it says more about our culture that so many American audience members, at least, wanted Walter White to succeed. Empathy is absolute, sympathy is optional. Likability doesn't guarantee audience involvement, it's just another aspect of characterization. What does audience identify with? Deep character, those choices made under pressure. A few notes. A character's mask is important. What other characters say about a character is a hint. Characters with lucid self-knowledge are boring and phony. And I talked about Dawson's Creek already. I won't belabor that point anymore. Don't reduce characters to case studies. The more a writer nails motivation to specific causes, the more the characters diminish in the audience's mind. A great example of this is Carol Hathaway on ER. Juliana Margulies, by the way, was the only lead actor on ER who won not just one Emmy, and she was the only lead actor who won an Emmy. Some of the guest stars did. But she won initially for supporting and then eventually for lead as the Hathaway character became more important. But what was kind of interesting is in the pilot episode of ER, it was a 2-hour movie. If you look at it, Margulies is billed as a guest star, and her character dies. And somebody at NBC gave the really wise note, "You got to bring her back." And the writers are like, "She's dead." And medically speaking, if you know how she died, you can't come back from that. And the network is like, "Well, fix it." So they looped a line saying, "She got better." But it was a wise decision because she became kind of the heart and soul of the show. But they never explained exactly why she tried to commit suicide. Was it because she was a nurse in a doctor's, a female nurse in a doctor's, male-dominated doctor's world? Was it because her mother is pressuring her to settle down and get married and have kids? It's because of her torturous relationship with George Clooney's Doug Ross. We never get the answer. The incident did happen. I think it was 3rd season that she wants to adopt this crack-addicted baby, and they're like, "Hey, you tried to commit suicide a few years ago. We're not going to let you adopt a crack baby." So, and I went to a writing workshop with the writers, 2nd season of ER, and somebody in the audience asked, "Why did Carol try to kill herself?" And the writers just looked at each other and said, "We haven't really made up our minds yet." And in the 6 years she was the main character on the show, they never said. Your protagonist must be the most dimensional character in the script. Otherwise, the center of good decenters and the fictional universe flies apart. An example of this is Rick Deckard in Blade Runner. By the way, there are 5 versions of that movie. My favorite is number 3, the 92 director's cut. I'm not happy with decisions that Sir Ridley has made to tinker with the film beyond that. But I would argue there's a reason for why Rick Deckard is not the most dimensional character in Blade Runner. But the problem is, since the audience can't connect with him because he's such an insular quasi, it's hard to describe the character if you haven't seen the movie, but trust me on this. He's not, the most interesting character in the script is Roy Batty, played by Rutger Hauer. And I would argue that a point of that version of the movie, or the previous versions of the movie, is that the synthetic human being is more human and interesting than the biological human being. baddie is more interesting than Deckard. And if you haven't seen the movie, you need to because it's my favorite sci-fi film. Finally, 3 tips for writing characters. Number 1, leave room for the actor. Don't overwrite. Would you like this cup of coffee, darling? I can rewrite that line in one word and appropriate action lines. Coffee, question mark. A wife in a silk robe, loosely tied, sidles up to her husband at breakfast and rubs the small of the back as she offers to pour a steaming hot cup of joe. Or is the scene about something else as I've constructed it? That's for you to decide. Second tip, fall in love with all your characters. Embrace all of them, even the bad ones, especially the bad ones. If you can't love them, don't write them. Great example of this is Commodus in Gladiator. The role earned Joaquin Phoenix an Oscar nomination. And, Daddy loves his gladiators more than he loves his own son. But he's a great character. And you could tell that the writers love Commodus. Finally, character is self-knowledge. There's only one person in this life that you ever really know. That's the one you see in the mirror every day. Ask, if you were this character in this situation, what would you do?